Welcome, everyone, to the Reader's Digest Book Club. I am your host, Tracey Neithercott, and I am here today, and I am so excited to have Colleen Oakley. She is the USA Today bestselling author of a few books, The Invisible Husband of Frick Island, You Were There Too, Close Enough to Touch, and Before I Go. But she is also the author of The Mostly True Story of Tanner and Louise, which is our April Book Club pick. Colleen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Tracey. I'm so excited to be here. I'm so honored you guys picked my book, and this is going to be so much fun.
I am thrilled because, as I was telling you, I flew through this book. Picked it up one Saturday morning, and I was like, I'm just gonna read this a little bit before I have to go and fold laundry and do a bunch of other stuff. And that did not happen at all. I was completely sucked in. I have been describing it to everyone as Thelma and Louise. If Thelma was a 20-something slacker and Louise was a feisty octogenarian who may or may not be the greatest jewelry thief of all time. But I would love for you to just tell us a little bit more about the book, quick synopsis, so anyone who hasn't read it yet knows what we're going to be discussing.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tanner and Louise, Mostly True Story of Tanner and Louise, is about Louise, an 84-year-old who has a hip injury, and her adult children decide that she needs live-in help. And Louise absolutely does not want live-in help. She's very independent and would rather not have it. But they insist. And so that live-in help comes in the form of 21-year-old Tanner, who does not want to be live-in help. But she's come to kind of a crossroads in her life, and it's really the only thing available to her, the only option. And so they kind of begrudgingly move in together and are happy to ignore each other until one night Louise bursts into Tanner's room at 1 a.m. With a bag full of cash, insisting that they leave town immediately. And thus begins an epic cross-country road trip where they are trying to outrun the mistakes of Louise's past and the police who are hot on their trail.
I love it. It's such a fun book. If anyone who has not read it, definitely pick it up because it's like complete entertainment. And for those of you who have read it and have questions, get them ready, put them in the comments, because at the end we are going to get to those. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the book and your writing process and everything like that. So let's start with Tanner and Louise. Where did you get the idea for this? Because it's such a fun idea, especially the interplay between Louise and Tanner.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So this, I like to say this is my most personal book, which might sound kind of weird since Tanner and Louise end up on the wrong side of the law, but it really was inspired by my relationship with my grandmother. Her name was Marion Oakley. She was one of my very favorite people on earth. She was very much like Louise. She was pragmatic. She was very funny, very bitingly sharp and witty. And one of my very favorite things about her is that she had one rule when you went to visit, and that was that you could do anything all day. You could shop and do touristy stuff, but at 5 p.m. sharp, you had to be there for cocktail time.
Love it.
And she very much enjoyed her vodka on the rocks, just like Louise. A few years before she passed, she lived to the age of 92 and died in February of 2020. But a few years before she died, she was diagnosed with late onset Parkinson's disease, which is a really rough condition, for many reasons, but also because of the concoction of medications that doctors put you on to help keep those symptoms at bay. Can cause their own side effects. And for my grandmother, that came in the form of hallucinations. And she really started to have difficulty, figuring out what was real and what was not. And so my grandmother and I, who spoke on the phone multiple times a week, our phone calls became a lot more interesting. And she started to say some, kind of outrageous, alarming things. Like one time I asked her what she had done that week, and she said, "Oh, I went on a submarine tour. It was lovely." And then another time she asked me if I had sent a check for her for $10,000 to New Jersey. And I said, "No, what for?" And she said, "To pay off my gambling debts."
Hilarious. You thought she was having an effect of the medicine,
Right?
as
So
far as
maybe
you know.
so my family and I kind of started sharing some of these more outrageous stories. One, because they were funny, and she, with her sharp sense of humor, would have also found them funny. But two, because what better way to deal with grief than,
Mhm,
sometimes with levity. And the novelist wheels in my brain started turning. And I just thought, what if my grandmother, who lived this amazing life in her own right, also had this other secret life that was just
mhm.
starting to come out at the end of her life? And that really was when the character of Louise was born.
Yep, yep, I love that. Um, how much of your understanding, because there's so much about, you know, aging or how
Mhm.
people, who are aging are viewed, or the, different the play between her and Tanner in terms of just the generational differences. How much of your understanding of Louise and her reactions and the way she thinks was from that personal experience or from, your grandmother?
Yeah, I think a lot of it. I mean, my grandmother and I, like I said, were really close, and we really had a lot of those honest
Mhm,
conversations. We used to actually take road trips together, just like Tanner and Louise. And so we had a lot of time to talk, and I would ask her questions, and she was very open with me about what it was like to age. And my mom is too. My mom's only 72, but she is also very honest with me about what it feels like to age. And what it feels like to age in a society where we tend to ignore people who are aging,
mhm,
particularly women, who aren't necessarily, we don't see them in books and on screens and in movies. And also with older people, particularly, we can infantilize them quite a bit.
mhm,
And we don't really revere our aged population. And so it was really important to me to tell the truth about that, and also to create a character in Louise who was a fully realized character at the age of 84, who had her own life, her own,
mhm.
desires, her own, secret past.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, you touched on that a bit, is that, Tanner, I think it was, in the beginning,
Mhm.
who's sort of treating, Louise like this old woman who doesn't really know anything. She's kind of,
Mhm.
off her rocker, and it's slowly revealed that maybe she does know as much as a 20-year-old, or maybe even more.
Yeah.
So how did that help you in creating the character of Tanner? Because she falls prey to a lot of the stuff you were just talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tanner really came to be, really just as the antithesis of Louise. That's where I started
Mhm,
from, because I knew that I wanted them to be such an odd couple, not just their generation gap, not just the age gap,
mhm,
but, I wanted Tanner to be someone who maybe follows the rules, who might be a little alarmed at somebody who does not follow the rules. And I also wanted Tanner to have some growing to do. And what 20-year-old doesn't have growing to do? I know I certainly did at the age of
mhm.
21. And so that's where kind of the beginning for Tanner came, and then she just grew from there.
Yeah, yeah, I love the differences, and I love that you made the 21-year-old the one who was more of a rule follower. It kind of flipped that on its head, which I thought was really fun.
Yeah.
Um, I do wanna go back to Louise, because you said this is such a personal story, and
Mhm.
you sort of pulled a lot from your relationship with your grandmother and your grandmother in general. So, was it harder to write for you than past books, or more emotional because of that?
Yeah, it was actually a little bit easier writing Louise's character, and I think mostly because it was so cathartic for me. I started writing this book very shortly after my grandmother passed, and so it was really a huge part of my grieving process, and very special. It was really joyful because I got to feel like I was spending time with my grandmother. And I would giggle and think about the things that she would say. She would just kind of come alive again in my mind. And so in that way, it was a little bit easier and harder, and just really joyful.
Yeah, yeah. I want to talk about the Parkinson's element, because, like you were
Mhm.
saying, your grandmother developed Parkinson's.
Mhm.
We know that Louise has it, and I'm curious what you saw the role of the book. Was it more just because you were essentially honoring your grandmother in this character, Or was there a greater purpose for her to develop Parkinson's in particular? And I had no idea about the medication. My grandfather has it and does not have that
Oh, good.
the hallucinations or anything like that. So I was
Yeah.
so shocked by that. But it was interesting, and it obviously played into the plot because
Right.
a lot of those things she says are brushed off as she's sick or whatever, and it kind of played nicely into what you're trying to do plot wise. But um, did you also include that, to build out her character as someone who's grappling with body issues or her aging body?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it was something that was also able to connect Louise and Tanner and able to bond them because, even though they're at different, ends of their spectrum and their body failing them, they both understand what that is. Tanner's body failed her in such a serious way that derailed her life. And Louise is also grappling with that. And I think that was able to connect them. And also, you're right. Like I definitely included it to pay homage to my grandmother, but to make you question too. Like what
Mhm.
is really real and what because it kind of makes Louise a little unreliable in that way.
Mhm, mhm. Well, yeah, and I think we, like Tanner in the beginning, are sort of like, is everything she says, how
Right.
much of that is a tall tale? And she, the way you wrote it kind of pulled us along a little bit. You held things close to the chest until the very end. So there is that element of like, yeah, but what did she actually do?
Yeah.
Which I think is great. But I also like, you're talking about the way people treat older people and aging, but I also liked how you flip that. And so we see the same thing happening with Louise's view of Tanner because
Mhm.
she sees this girl and is like, she's those Gen Z, they're just so lazy and don't want to do anything. And it's only after they have that, revelation moment where she sees, okay, well, she's in pain and,
Mhm.
her those complaints were valid as well. So I thought that was really great. Just look at pain and from both ends of the spectrum, what it's like
Mhm.
when your body fails you. Um, so I want to talk about the book in terms of Thelma and Louise, because obviously it's very,
Mhm.
very clear from the title of the book, from the cover, we can see that there's some similarities there. What made you use that movie as a vehicle, pardon the pun, for
Pun
yes,
intended.
for telling this story of this woman who may or may not have done something illegal in the past?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Thelma and Louise is one of my favorite all-time movies. And I actually watched it again while I was writing this book as part of my research, and I'm very pleased to say it holds up. So, if there's anybody out there who has not seen this iconic film, go watch it. It's so great. But I remember seeing it, as a young girl. I was probably 13 or 14 the first time I saw it, and then watching it again probably in my 20s, and so on. And it always felt like I got something different out of it each time I watched it and an understanding about what it is to be a woman in the world. But I think that movie captured a very specific time period, right? Like when
Mhm.
it came
Yeah,
out, it was, I don't know, 1991, I want to say. I should know that, but I don't. I
no
think it was early
idea.
90s. And so I really felt like I wanted to capture a very specific time period. I wanted to capture what it means to be a woman in the world in 2023, both from the
Mhm,
perspective of obviously a 21-year-old and an 84-year-old who has lived through so much, right?
mhm.
And I really feel like I was examining how far we've come as women and in society, but also how far we still have to go.
Yeah, yeah, because you do get the background from Louise, as we get further
Right.
into the book. So you're sort of seeing from her perspective what it was like back then, what it is now. And she comments at least once, I think maybe
Hmm.
even more, like, it's not enough, or where we are now isn't enough. Just look at what happened to Tanner.
Right.
It's still not perfect. So, how important was it for you to tell that story of the past. I think it was maybe the 60s. Was am I
Yeah.
thinking about that? Of what, without going too spoilery, because I know that's a that's a big reveal at the end. How important was it for you to explain that, you know, uh, basically what's happening for women in the past, or that element that led her to do the things that she did?
Yeah,
If I
it
can
was really
be.
important. Yeah, it was really important to me. You know, when I go into a book, I don't go into it necessarily thinking I have something to say to the world. I go into it with questions, with things that I'm thinking about, things that keep me awake at night. You know, I have 4 children. I have 2 daughters and 2 sons. So I think a lot about what this world is going to be like for them as they grow up. And, you know, are things better than when I was a kid, than when my mom was little? Yeah, I think so. But do we still have a ways to go? Like, are there still things I really, really worry about, especially for my daughters? Absolutely. And so I did a lot of research into second wave feminism, which is that time period between the 60s and the 80s. A lot because obviously that's what Louise would have
Mhm.
lived through and that would have informed her life experience. But you know, I think that the some of the information I found out was really shocking to me. And so it was really important to show, yeah, we have come a long way from some of these things, like, you know, women not being able to get a credit card without their husband's
Mhm.
permission until 1974. America didn't have its first domestic violence shelter, which they called battered women's shelters back then, until 1973, which is
Really?
crazy to me. I mean, all of these women really had nowhere to turn to.
Wow.
And so in that respect, I think we've come a really long way, and thank goodness. But in some other respects, you know, like I found out the first woman didn't get onto the Forbes 500 list until I think it was 1972, and that was Katharine Graham with the Washington Post. And now, today, we have 40 women out of 500 on the Forbes 500 list. So
Better,
I think
but
better, much better than one, and I'll take it. But I think that shows that we still
yeah,
have quite some ground to make up there.
yeah, yeah. Nope, that makes sense. That's fascinating, the stuff that you found from your research. I'm curious what other research you did, particularly because, Louise's life experiences are probably very different from yours just because of the time period.
Yeah, so I did a lot of research on heists, which was quite fun.
Mhm.
We have some doozies, and some that are a lot of cold cases that people have
Mhm.
no idea, you know, where the merchandise or the art or the jewelry, you know, currently is, which I thought was interesting. I did a lot of research on the FBI and police work because that is something I am completely unfamiliar with.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, I had a friend in the Georgia Bureau of Investigation who gave me a lot of
Oh,
great insight into that. Yeah, and of course, I just did a lot of research. You know, a lot of Louise does come from my grandmother, but again, I did a lot of research into that time period and what
mhm.
it would have been like to grow up, you know, or be, you know, even a young adult in the 60s, 70s, and 80s
Mhm.
as a woman in our country.
Nice. Yeah, I love that. Um, I also want to talk about the friendship between the two of them because I've seen takes on Thelma and Louise, books about
Mhm.
road trips between friends before, but I think what stood out to me so much for this one is that intergenerational friendship that you've created. So I know that your grandmother inspired this. What made you want to have that element versus, say, another woman her age or 220 somethings, which is probably the most common or most likely to see that right now. So, what about that subplot really interested you?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't just my grandmother. Obviously, she was a huge piece of it because I learned so much from her and our relationship was so special to me. But I think as a whole, you know, looking at our culture, like I was talking about earlier, how we don't revere older people, you know, I feel like in our society, people who have gotten to a certain point, 70s, 80s, 90s, they have such a breadth of experience and wisdom and advice that we really don't appreciate at all. And particularly for someone who's 21, who has no perspective on life, who really could use somebody who has a lot of experience and perspective to guide her. I just really enjoyed bringing that relationship to life, and really showcasing how important that is. I think about cultures. I think it's in Finland where they put nursing homes next to daycares, and they have social events so that the kids can interact with the older people and the older people can interact with the kids. And I think that is so special. There's so much to be learned and so much to be enjoyed, and it's such a gift. And we do not do that in American culture. So if people can take anything from this book, besides it just being a fun escape and adventure, which is what I hope everybody takes from it, I'd really love if it made people think, oh, maybe I should ask my grandmother some more questions, or my great aunt, or the neighbor down the street, who's been through some things. Like, maybe I should strike up a relationship with them, and vice versa. Like, older people maybe have something to learn from younger people too, which I think was the case with Louise and Tanner. I hope.
Yeah, it's surprising. You kind of expected Tanner to learn something about her life, or
Mhm.
the fact that her life isn't over. And very understandable that she was feeling that way. But I loved that she sort of got that kick from someone who had just so much happened in her life. I mean, more than you can imagine for your own life. And it's just so fascinating. But, being able to see how that sort of inspires Tanner, and puts into perspective how little you have lived. That's
Yes.
part of what you were saying, is you open yourself up to those stories, and you learn, I feel like I have lived so much, but really, comparatively, I have a lot to learn. So I thought that was just really wonderful. Um, I'm very curious who you identify more with, Tanner or Louise, personality wise, or as you're writing it, if you felt more like you could channel yourself through one or the other.
Yeah, I definitely identify with Louise. I think it's one of the reasons my grandmother and I were so close, is because we are very
Mhm.
similar. I absolutely, if I am lucky enough to live to be the age of, 80, 85, 90, I want to be that feisty old woman
Mhm.
still drinking vodka in the afternoon, and a little bit of a rule breaker. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
You're saying there is a giant diamond hidden somewhere, somewhere.
If there
You,
is, I'm selling it and moving
yeah,
to Italy.
exactly. Yeah, I love that idea of, like, I probably related more to Tanner, but I was like, reading it, you're like, Louise is much more fun. She is much more exciting, and who you would
It's
want to hang
okay
out
to be a Tanner as
with.
long as you have a Louise in your life, right? Everybody needs
Exactly.
a Louise.
You just gotta pick your friends like that.
That's
But
right.
I
That's
loved
right.
I love that. And so I also loved, and I was surprised that this is one of my favorite aspects of the book, are these chapters that happen throughout. We get different perspectives, mostly from Tanner, mostly from Louise, but we also get the police and stuff. And I love the ones from Louise's children, which completely surprised me because I wasn't expecting them. And they are, if you have not read this book, they are hilarious. Especially Jules, the oldest, very type A, worrywart, and her brother, and who is the complete opposite. That cracked me up. So, what made you put those in? Because they don't 100% affect the plot where they're necessary that way, but they feel necessary for understanding Louise, and just the past and stuff. So what made you insert those and come up with those characters?
Yeah, I think a couple reasons. The first and main reason that I put them in there along with the FBI and police, chapters, is that, this is a mystery essentially. It kind of bends genres, the book, but there's
Mhm.
a mystery at the heart of it. And I knew we were going to be in Louise's head, but we couldn't be in Louise's head too much, because I
Mhm.
had to really pace what I allowed the reader to know. And so having these outside perspectives with the kids and the FBI and the police trying to figure out the mystery and what Louise has really done and what is happening along with the reader allows the mystery to unravel at a good pace and to get information from outside perspectives, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then I really also, the story is so much about relationships. It's so much about obviously the intergenerational one, but also mother-child relationships and what those look like. Obviously female friendships, all of that. But I thought it was great to get perspective of adult children and how they handle an aging parent, with some health problems of her own and how that doesn't always go smoothly. And I'm sure there are some people out there who are dealing with that who can agree and understand.
Never does. It never does. I love it because you see the frustration of it because, people can be very stubborn about their health and stuff. And you also get it from Louise's perspective where she doesn't want to let go of that independence. And
Yes, exactly.
so I like that you get both perspectives. And like you were saying, we don't want to hear too much or can't hear too much
Right.
about Louise thinking about her children for some spoilery reasons. So I thought that was great the way you kept a certain thing that happened so secret until the very, very end. I did not guess that twist at all. So without saying too much there, I thought that was really, really fun. So you mentioned that you had gone on road trips with your grandmother or before. So I am curious, did you take the same road trip? And if not, what is one that you have gone on that would be, if not this fun, close to as fun as the one they had?
I actually did take half of this road trip, and I didn't even know I was going to write this novel at the time when I took it. So it wasn't on purpose, but my husband and I, we have 4 children. We live in Atlanta, and we decided one summer that we were going to drive out to visit my cousin and her family who live in Denver, Colorado. And so we packed up the car. We drove 23 and a half hours from Atlanta to Denver, Colorado over, many, many days. We had a lot of stops along the way. And so when I started writing this book, I was very familiar with the route that Tanner and Louise would take. A lot of the stops that they made were the same ones that we made. The St. Louis Arch, we have pictures of our kids at the St. Louis Arch. And in fact, what happened at the St. Louis Arch for Tanner and Louise, which I'm not going to say and spoil, was very inspired by what happened to my family and I at the St. Louis Arch. Yes.
Now I'm really curious about the spoilery parts. Someone not loving heights in your family. Funny. Oh, I love that. I want to pull back. I know we've got reader questions coming in, but I want to pull back really quickly because this is not your first novel, and it is just your latest. So how would you describe one of your books? Because this one is, got some quirky situations and characters, but you also wrote, and in case anyone isn't aware, The Invisible Husband of Frick Island is about a woman whose husband died and her and the entire town that she lives in pretends that he is alive. So that's also very, very quirky and offbeat of a story. So is that sort of how you would explain your books, or what threads through all of them if people are looking to learn a little bit more about your other work?
Yeah, each one of my books has a very bizarre kind of outrageous element, like the hook of the book. That is my challenge to make it feel very grounded and real for the reader, like that this could actually be happening. And what I say that I write, if I had to give my books a tagline, I would say that I write unconventional love stories because at the heart of each of my books is the human connection. And sometimes it's romantic love. Sometimes it's this beautiful friendship, like between Tanner and Louise. But, so love stories, but unconventional.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you also get it like between Tanner and Louise. There's also between Louise and George, which is throughout, you read it and you're thinking that's one type of love story, and
Yep.
in the end it turns out to be something completely different. So yeah, and that their whole story is a bit unconventional. So I love that. I'm curious because you said you wrote this. Did you write it in 2020? You said
Yeah.
so
during
the
that,
pandemic.
yes.
How was your process different? From previous books, or I'm imagining, your life was probably different, like everyone's was.
Yeah.
What was the process like for writing this one versus others?
Yeah, this one, it was more challenging to find writing time
Mhm.
actually because I was homeschooling for
Yeah.
children, which was never aspirational for me. um, yeah, so it was very difficult to find time. That this 2020 is the year that I started my 5 a.m. writing routine, which is also something I never thought I'd do. I don't enjoy waking up early, but I really found that that was so helpful to get up, an hour or two before all the kids were up and have just quiet time to myself to write. And this one was the one that I've actually started taking 3 to 4 day writer retreats
Mm.
by myself to just get away from, the chaos and really focus on the work. And that's also proved really great the past couple years to be able to do that. And I mean, I have an amazing husband, that has to be said.
Not that you're not a teacher anymore.
Yeah, and I'm not a teacher anymore, thank goodness. That was certainly, I did not miss my calling, I learned.
That always helps a bit. Um, well, I have one final question for you before we go on and answer reader questions. And that is,
Great.
because we all love books here. What are some books that you have loved recently or that we should be reading because they are completely amazing?
I have had a run of great books recently. I just read and loved I Have Some Questions for You by
Oh,
Rebecca
I loved
Makkai.
that one. That's a great book.
Oh my gosh, it was so great. I immediately thrust it into the hands of my mother. We were on
Yeah.
book tour together, and then she read it immediately and loved it. It was so great. Another one that I cannot stop talking about is The Woman with the Cure by Lynn
Mhm.
Cullen. It's historical fiction. If you love historical fiction, she is a great author. This is, I think, her fifth book. But she always finds those women in history that are little known about, and she brings their stories to the forefront. And this one is about the scientist, the female scientist who was integral in finding the vaccine for polio. And who knew that a female
I
scientist
know
was
you don't hear
involved
about.
in that? You don't hear about it, and it is fantastic. I actually read that book in one night, as
Oh
one of
wow.
those where I stayed up till 3 a.m. because she had me gripped in what was happening. And then another one, and this one is kind of dark, but I'd also just loved it. Notes on an Execution
I've
by
never read that.
Dania Kukofka, I think. I'm probably mispronouncing her last name, but it is about a serial killer on death row, and it's told from the perspective of the women that have been affected by him. It's told from the perspective of his mother, the perspective of his ex-wife's sister, and the perspective of the female detective who finally captured him or caught him. And I mean, it was so good. So I highly recommend that one.
Those are going on my to read list for sure. Well, I want to make sure we get to all the reader questions. So
Mhm.
I am going to kick it over to Lauren to uh, go through some of these questions that everyone has for you. I see one of them is something I was also wondering about. So I'm glad someone asked
Do you
it.
want to go ahead and ask what?
Okay, so yeah, I want to ask what someone else that has a question of is what do you think of, and I should say, first off, big spoiler alert if
Yeah,
you
Oh, yes.
we are
Time to sign
entering.
off if you haven't read.
We are
yes.
entering the spoiler zone.
Yes. So, what do you think Tanner does with the diamond? Like, let's say immediately, or
Mm.
5 months, or 5 years, 10 years, any point in the future. What is she doing with that?
Oh, what does she do with it? What do you think she does with it?
I love that answer. I love also the answer of like, I guess you'll have to read.
That's right. That's right. In the sequel. No.
Someone in the group mentioned this, and someone else said, "Well, I think maybe she could turn it into the police," which I think is a very possible Tanner thing and very Tanner chapter 1 thing that she would definitely have done, because that's what you do. But I like to think that, this is new Tanner. This is like post Louise Tanner, and she would do something fun with it. She probably could not cash it legally. But I feel like she would probably do something fun. What do you think she would do?
I think
I don't know.
I think
I
she
don't
would
know.
go
What do
up-
you think, Lauren?
I think she would go up to that arch and Titanic style drop it off. Drop it off the side of that arch.
That's great. I haven't heard that one before. That's awesome. That's
Launches
awesome.
like a murder mystery.
I do like for this to be, part of the reader's journey and the reader's imagination. So I don't want to say specifically what I think she does with it, but I will say that I do not think she turns it in, because I do think that she has become a different person, like you said, from the beginning of the book.
Yeah.
So I don't think she does that.
I agree with that. Yeah. No one when the inciting incident is like, have fun following the rules your whole life,
Right.
At a real existential change.
Someone else said that maybe she passes it on to like her children or her grandchildren. I like that idea too. She's now the old woman passing it on to someone. So
yes. And you're passing it on like we pass on stories, right? Like sharing the story of my life and what happened. And let me tell you the story of this diamond and how
this
I got
one
it.
time I went on a road trip.
That's right.
I
I love that.
On the note of passing on stories, you mentioned that your grandmother passed away before you had this book published, but did you ever get a chance to share the beginning seedlings of this novel with her before she passed away?
I did. I don't know how much of it she understood, but I definitely read the dedication to her, which I think was special to her. I hope it was special to her. I dedicate it to her, my other grandmother, Penny, and my mom and my sister, the four most important women in my life, who really, I feel like, taught me how to be a woman,
And your mother, did she read all of your books, or?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. Yes. My mom is also my best copy editor. So she goes through and really marks it up with a red pen and makes sure that my grammar is correct before a real copy editor gets a hold of it. But she reads all my books. Yeah, she reads all my books multiple times.
We all need someone like that in our family, because they can read our work with a little less judgment, I would hope.
Yes.
You're getting that. It's wonderful, sweetie.
Yeah. It was great. That actually, there's another question. Is Tanner's family, especially her mom, based on any family that you know?
No, not really. They're definitely fictional, but I certainly created them all as, things that Tanner would be grappling with. So, and things that are relatable, like I definitely struggled with my relationship with my mom in my late teens and 20s. So that was very, very easy to write. My sister and I also didn't get really close until we were adults. And so, so they weren't based on my family, but certainly those relationships I could definitely relate to and were very easy to write.
Can we expect to see a Tanner and Louise adaptation for film or television?
Well, I certainly hope so. I can say that it has been optioned by a big production company. Awesome. I think they're still very early in the process. They have got some writers connected and are I think headed out to pitch and try and get a studio connected, and we'll see. Hopefully, all the fingers crossed. The fingers crossed.
I feel like this, like just reading it, it felt very cinematic. I could picture. I was even starting to cast it in my brain with like, who would play August?
Who would you cast? I'm dying to know.
I'm thinking. My brain. I'm not even kidding. Went to the guy that was in Stranger Things as Billy. I forget the name.
Oh yeah, I know who you're talking about.
I could totally see him.
Which actually, there's another question. I don't know if we want to talk more about casting, but how did the character of August develop?
Yeah, so that was part of the homage to Thelma and Louise. Obviously, Thelma and Louise is not the movie that it is without Brad Pitt and his wonderfulness on screen. And so I needed a little eye candy for Tanner and Louise. But I really also, speaking of Thelma and Louise and the male characters, it was really important to me. There is not one good male character in Thelma and Louise. They all turn out to be pretty bad dudes.
Yeah.
And so it was important to me, since I was kind of updating what it is to be a woman in the world, to show, I have wonderful men in my life, and I wanted there to be male characters in Tanner and Louise who are also just really good people. And so August, I hope everybody liked him, but he was also a good person. Even though he'd been through some things, he's a good guy.
Yeah. Well, and he was kind of great for pushing Tanner, that initial, she's not going to listen to this old woman at first.
Right.
But when a good looking guy shows up, that's the first time we see her think, okay, well, maybe I should shower. It's been a few days. Maybe I should care about things. So he was a good push toward that, choice she makes, at that inciting incident where she's like, okay, I'll go with you. He's already helped her a little bit get off the couch in one way. So I loved him.
We're all strong, independent, driven women, but sometimes it does take just seeing a pretty man.
That's right. Or a little inspiration.
All right, here's what we're going to do. Have that little makeover montage moment. So you mentioned that the Arch story was truly based on family events, and Tracey, as well as the person who wrote this comment, jumped to someone in your family must have a fear of heights. I thought, I was like, oh, someone must have had a gun on him. So their question is, are you the member of your family with a fear of heights? My question is, does someone in your family have a
Yeah, now that we're in the spoiler portion, I can tell the story. So there's 6 people in my family, my husband and I and our 4 kids. 3 of us have a very strong fear of heights. And I'm one of them for sure. But we were all going to do it. We were going to go up in this arch because you're there and you have to do it. And so we got our tickets and we got in line. And like I said, we were on this road trip and we were supposed to be in Kansas City at my brother's house by dinner time. And we had been delayed that day for various reasons. And the line was very long. And as we were kind of meandering through this long snaking line to get to the front, about halfway through, my husband says, Colleen, I really don't think, we have the time for this. We're going to be so late. We're not even it's going to be way past dinner by the time we get to your brother's house. And I said, you're right. And half of us are terrified of heights anyway. So let's just get back on the line. And so it was such a calamity, trying to get 6 people out of this very tight line. And so, it caused a lot of commotion and raised a lot of eyebrows. And when we got out of the line, the security guard showed up directly in front of us and stopped our forward motion and said, I have to ask why you got out of line. And I said, oh, we just realized that the line was too long and we weren't going to have time to do it today. And he said, well, it looked like you got out of line when you saw the metal detector. And I have to ask, do you have a weapon on you? And my husband and I looked at each other like, we have 4 little kids. Yeah. We were like, what? But we said no, and he let us go. But it was still, we laughed about it on the way to the car. Like, we look like it's the type of people that are bringing a gun to the St. Louis Arch.
I loved that scene. I loved the way she played Tanner there and just got her way. Hilarious.
Next question. What are you working on next? And can you give us any details?
Yeah, I can give just a very, very little synopsis. So I'm about 3/4 of the way through my next book. And it's about a couple who's been married for 19 years and they're on the brink of divorce. And they go to a very isolated 5-star Michelin restaurant. And while they're eating dinner, an underground eco-terrorist group bursts into the restaurant and takes the entire restaurant hostage.
Wow.
And it is called Jane and Dan at the End of the World.
Wow.
That sounds so different from Tanner and Louise, except when you said that title. And then I was like, oh, wait a minute. This sounds like it's going to be similar in some way.
Yeah, definitely a little quirkiness, a little dark comedy.
I'm picturing that movie Date Night.
Yes, it's so funny you both said that because my agent calls it Die Hard meets Date Night.
Oh, I love
There you go.
On the note of titles, what makes this the quote unquote mostly true story of Tanner and Louise? Is there something you still don't know?
I think for me, it was because I knew as I was writing it that the reader was never going to feel like they had the whole story or what was true and what was not. And, you know, there was a little bit of whiplash going back and forth about what, you know, trying to figure out what Louise really was doing or what she had done. And so the mostly true story seemed to fit. And also, you know, in retrospect, I can say that I thought of this at the beginning, but I didn't. In retrospect, I think, you know, really it depends on who's telling the story and what is the truth anyway, right? Like our perspectives are so wildly different that you never, ever get the full truth when somebody is telling a story. So I think it fits to call it the mostly true story.
And for most of the book, it is the mostly true story. I mean, Louise is very careful about giving Tanner and everyone else the mostly true story of what is happening.
Exactly.
So until the very end, we sort of only get that mostly true story.
Yes. She certainly reserves any details that are not necessary.
Yes.
Well, this is, unless we get any other questions in the next 2 minutes, this is our last question. I'm sure it's a question writers love getting, but when did you discover you had a writing gift?
Oh, I don't know. I think I'm still searching for it. I'm hoping that the gift will just hit me. But no, I've always loved to write. I really have my mother to thank for that because I've always loved to read. She is, her entire career has been dedicated to teaching adults how to read. And so literacy was very, very important in my house. And I've been reading books since I was very, very little. And, you know, we had reading time every single night. And then really writing books ever since I could hold a crayon. I just thought that it was so fun to make up stories. My mom still has kind of a box of them somewhere in the attic, I'm sure. But yeah, so I always wanted to be a writer. And of course I went through all kind of different things. I also wanted to be a Disney animator and live on a farm and, you know, all the different things that kids want to do.
All very related.
Yes. But being a writer was certainly the through line all the way up till I went to college and went to journalism school.
Right. And then you were a writer, you know, you wrote for magazines and then transitioned to writing your first novel, right?
Yeah.
Fascinating. So that's all the questions we have on my end. But yeah, I think this has been so delightful to hear more about this.
Oh my gosh. Thank you. This has been so fun. Thank you to everybody out there who read the book and I hope you loved it. And it's just been so great. Thank you.
Yes. I'm so glad you could join us. For those of you who have not read it yet, it is the mostly true story of Tanner and Louise. We will be putting a link to the book in the comments. So if you haven't gotten it yet, you can get it and read it. I honestly cannot tell you how fast I read this book and not on purpose. It's just so much fun. It's for one of those times when you're in a really bad mood or feeling kind of down and you're like, I just want to laugh and feel, you know, it's just one of those happy books. So definitely pick it up. And Colleen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It was so much fun.
And everyone else, next month, we are going to be reading Only Love Can Hurt Like This. So pick that up. We'll be reading it all throughout May. And until then, happy reading.